Good morning, everyone. Let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master, Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to all of you. Help us to feel your living presence within our hearts. Help us to listen carefully and respond courageously to your inner promptings, that all that we do will bring us closer to the infinite light, to your perfect love and joy. Om, peace. Amen. Before I begin talking about happiness in our roadmap to right living based on the qualities in Swamiji's book, this wonderful Affirmations for Self-Healing book, I just wanted to tell you about an upcoming event, excuse me, which will be, I think it's the 20th it's the weekend of the 20th of May. And it's in Temecula, California, Southern California, sponsored by Crystal Clarity Publishers and Ananda, Los Angeles. And the wonderful artist Dana Anderson is going to be leading one of her creativity workshops. It's a residence workshop in person. And there's just a few places left. And on this particular weekend, I'm going to be there also, both taking the workshop and also helping to give the workshop. So it'll be great fun, and we'll all be together for the weekend. So you can go to Crystal Clarity Publishers and look up the Art and Creativity Dana Anderson workshop, and you can find out the details. And I think there's just 4 places left. So if any of you have that weekend free and would like to spend it all together in a very fun way, please look into that. Okay, yesterday I had intended to finish the subject of happiness, which is our third quality for our roadmap. And when I was just sort of reviewing the description of the quality before going into the affirmation and the prayer, I started seeing all kinds of things that I hadn't seen before. And I actually just had to end practically in the middle of a sentence because there were so many ideas. And so I wanted to make sure that I finished a few thoughts that were left undone. I have a tendency, as you all know, to start improvising. One thought leads to another. And there we go. A friend of mine who was a drummer, he used to explain how you just start playing and then your rhythm accidentally shifts and then the new rhythm becomes a new rhythm, and that's how you just move from theme to theme in music. And that's how I think about myself. I think I speak jazz. One thing leads to the next, and I even call it, I riff on these various themes. And so I started riffing, and it's kind of a game with me too, because usually I don't leave unfinished ends. It's something happens in my brain or in a force outside my brain, and somewhere along the line I'm reminded. But every once in a while I do leave something on the table, and it pops into my head. Sometimes it'll pop into my head the next day that I left something unfinished on the table. And yesterday I was talking about the demographic of the people who are attracted to Ananda, and at the very end I used the word demographic again, and then it crossed my mind that I'd left it. Because it's a very important point. Because I did a lot of the marketing for Ananda for many years, for Ananda Palo Alto. Well, I did the marketing for Ananda itself, but I did it so incompetently I try not to remember. I think I did a little better job here. I finally learned how to do it. But you know, when you're trying to communicate to people that you have something to offer that might be of benefit to them, you have to try to think, you know, what is the benefit and to whom would it be a benefit? So in other words, who benefits, who would be naturally in tune with what you're doing. And our demographic, so to speak, has always been a little hard to quantify because it's there appears to be not that much consistency. There's a wide variety of eccentricity, ages and backgrounds within already narrowed, and I did speak of that yesterday. To those who have had some capacity to experience the benefits of this world and are therefore ready to think beyond the benefits of this world. I've jokingly repeated at different times what a woman said to me who was coming to our temple. She'd been going to various places in the area, trying to find a place that inspired her. And she said to me, I've been to a lot of different places. Mostly she was going in the Eastern New Thought sort of area. And everybody talks about overcoming the ego. And then she said, but I have the impression that you people really mean it. Which I repeat that often because it amused me so much, because she's right. It's one thing to say, love thy neighbor as thyself, and it's another to actually mean it. And she never came back. But the demographic I was trying to speak yesterday is, this is the real key. At some point it occurs to you that the outer reality is an expression of the inner reality. And therefore, if I wish to have any influence over my own destiny, I need to become skilled at attuning to inner reality, which eventually leads to self-mastery. And that from that point of inner strength, everything else will follow. And that is the unifying key. There has to be either some intuition or some actual experience that what appears to be real is actually a reflection of a deeper reality. And this was why, interestingly enough, and Swami Kriyananda even conceded this, and I'm going back, 50 years when I say this, but I was part of the hippie generation that, we just grabbed the direction of society in the USA and just made a right turn, made a perpendicular turn from where it was going. And part of that was psychedelics, the sort of the influx of primarily LSD at that time, which is not a good idea. And I know the whole drug scene shifted radically from where it was in the late 60s. And I was only a tiny part of it because I like my brain. And I like my brain clear. And I didn't like messing with my brain. But one psychedelic experience was enough to tell me, oh my God, it's not what's going on the outside, it's the inside. If I change my consciousness, I change everything. And even Swamiji, who had very strong feelings against that kind of drug use, meaning he would take medicines, but not that, he said he had to concede that it was the catalyst for a lot of what became extremely serious spiritual searching. I got very serious on the spiritual path and very unserious about drug-induced experiences because the drug-induced was temporary. I wanted permanent. But that's the demographic that we're looking for. So I wanted to finish that thought. And then I also was touching on the issue of money and giving money, which, yesterday was Money Monday, so I didn't want to be self-serving in it. But nonetheless, I deeply believe in it, which is why I can sit here and very calmly and quite sincerely ask you to support the mission of the Masters, which is I might have overnamed this a little bit, but I don't like things to be overnamed, meaning you give it a bigger name than it deserves. But when I was trying to really say what I am doing, that was the name that came to me repeatedly. It's the mission of the Masters because it's not personal. I had to say it for what it was. One of the reasons I set it up as nonprofit religious group was just because I had to say it for what it was. It's not mine. It's just something that I'm privileged to do. But I can speak to you without the slightest hesitation, and I've been a very good fundraiser for Ananda for a long time, even though I'm not a money manager in any way. But I understand the necessity to act upon what we believe, and I understand the magnetism of acting upon what we believe. And there's no more dynamic place, what's the phrase, it's where the rubber meets the road, than when you ask the question of what do I spend money on? And where do I think prosperity comes from? And how much faith do I have in the divine flow? And do I believe in the law of karma? You can run it all down the line, and you can put dollar signs by all of that. And there's nothing, I mean, money is not, it's not an anathema subject to talk about. And I've always been a little bit, even people call indelicate about it. I just think we should just talk straight about it. It's one of the ways we can tell what we really believe. And I don't mean that you can prove to others what you really believe. Not at all. You can prove to yourself what you really believe. In my own life, for various reasons, I never had to pay any practical attention to money. There was always somebody in my life who was very skilled and at ease with it, just took care of it for me. And then in the last decade, all of a sudden, I had to take personal responsibility for it. And it was very interesting to me because I'd never been concerned about it. But I realized it wasn't because I trusted God. It was because I had relinquished the responsibility to another person, and I trusted that person, which is a little bit like trusting God, but not the same, not at all the same. And I had to really go much deeper into my own heart. What do I really believe is true? And so when I brought this up, let me think, oh yes, resolve strongly to keep this flame of happiness burning ever in your heart. So I was talking at length yesterday, and this is when I ran out of time, I was talking at length yesterday about what it is to feed the flame, and what is it that feeds the flame of happiness, and what feeds the flame of happiness, as Swami is describing it here, is to act according to the principles of happiness, which is to make the inner world the source of your happiness rather than depending on outer circumstances. In the course of the last few weeks, some very sad things have happened to extended members of our Ananda family, just expectations that were interrupted by death. This is one of those things that happens to people. Death comes and interrupts things. We have a certain plan in our mind that this is how things are going to go, and then death comes and interrupts it. We don't expect death to come at any moment, but that's naive of us. Just as simple as that. It's very naive. And now I guess I think I'm going to go in a different direction here for a moment. It's like, and I did touch on this earlier, but now I'm going to touch on it a little more deeply. If we don't want to have our happiness be dependent on external things, and I think I touched on this already, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. One of the ways people mistakenly think that we protect ourselves from external disappointment is never to open ourselves to the possibility of disappointment. And for quite a number of years in my life, much more than I realized, excuse me, I just need to cough, much more than I realized in my life, there was levels of protection. I remember at a certain point when I had, so we think that we're strong because we have barricaded ourselves. And the difference between being strong because we are fearless and being strong because we are barricaded is everything. And I do recall I did talk about this a lot, about Swami Kriyananda's absolute fearlessness in just allowing the forces of the world to come through. But when we get knocked over, because more than we may have realized, we have allowed ourselves to center our happiness in external conditions. Now, we just do. We have to. Let me phrase this differently. We have to we have to have the courage to allow our karma to express and to allow our karma to teach us. And we don't learn by holding back from that. So it takes a great deal of courage and a great deal of trust to really give ourselves. I remember very early on in my spiritual life when I was really just learning to really trust God. And I found I was hurt by something that someone did. And as it happened, it was very interesting because at the time I was living at Ananda, and we had these wooden tables outside. We were always trying to figure out how to do what we were doing. It was a very simple thing. We had wooden tables, but they were exposed to the weather and they were beginning to not look very good. So there was this polyurethane paint, which is, just plastic paint. And so you could paint over the wooden surface, and it still looked like a wooden table, but it had a permanent couple of layers of this plastic paint on top of it, so you could wash it and it wouldn't be hurt by the weather. Nowadays they have all these synthetic materials, but this was 50 years ago and they didn't. And I remember thinking that because I had made myself vulnerable, and because I had made myself vulnerable, I was now being hurt by it, that I felt this idea that I could just paint I could paint my heart with a little polyurethane. And then I would look just the same. I would still look like I was wide open, but I would have put this shield up. Now, of course, when you shield like that, not that much things that are trying to enter can't get in, and things that are trying to get out can't escape. So all of a sudden, I have barricaded myself. And I remember, now this is all just a long time, but I remember years later being in now let me just finish that thought so I don't leave it on the table. But what I realized was, and this is something that actually Swami Kriyananda talked about too. He talked about, he was driving in a car, this was like in the early 60s before Ananda started, when Swami had been expelled from Master's organization where he'd been for 14 years. He hadn't yet started Ananda, and he was sort of moving about trying to figure out what he was supposed to do next. And he was driving down the coast, and there was a hitchhiker. Swami picked up the hitchhiker, and the guy, they're driving, and the guy starts giving Swami a story about his hard luck and how he needed the money and this, and basically he's hitting Swamiji up for cash. Swami himself did not have very much money at the time. He was living securely in his parents' house, so he wasn't really in a position of actual deprivation, but he didn't have much money. And so he's listening to this guy talk, and he's thinking, either this man is scamming me, or he genuinely needs the money. But in any case, he needs money, whichever way he's going. So Swamiji said to him something about, I don't have much money. Swami opened his wallet, and he had like $50. And so he said, I'll give you half of what I have. So he gave the man 25, which in 1961, 64 or something, was more money than it is now. In 1970, in the early 70s, I earned $50 a month living in Ananda Village. I did have my home and place taken care of, but still it wasn't a lot, but it was enough. So Swami gave him $25. And then the guy gives him this big, talk and says, I made an elaborate thing of taking down Swami's name and address so that he could pay him back. And I promise I'll pay you back, this guy said, because I wouldn't want you to lose your faith in humanity. That's what he says. Swami laughed and he said, I lost my faith in humanity a long time ago. He said, I'm not trusting you, I'm trusting God. There's a very important distinction. He didn't distrust this man. Maybe the man would pay him back, and of course he never did. But what Swami trusted was that everything that comes is coming from the divine, and if we respond appropriately with Dharma, then that's where we come back to, where there's Dharma, there is always victory. If we respond appropriately according to Dharma as we understand it, then the divine flow will take care of itself. And if this man doesn't give the money back, then life will give the money back, one way or another, if it was the right thing to do, and if the money is what you might say genuinely and truthfully owed to Swamiji. If life owes Swamiji a return, then the return will come. And when I say life, what I mean is the divine balance of truth. Because sometimes our lesson is to be deprived, and sometimes our lesson is to be supported. And people get very confused on this point, especially what I used to call the New Age way of thinking, because they equate righteousness, Dharma, and God's will with my personal preferences. And that's the whole thing that Swami's talking about, happiness, which is, it's not in things, it's not an outward attainment, it's a decision to be happy all the time. We know nothing outside of us can affect our happiness. No disappointment, no failure, no misunderstanding. And as I was saying yesterday, whoa, that is a big challenge, isn't it? But that's where we're heading. And therefore, we act according to the highest principles we can understand, being practical in our idealism, very important to be practical in what we do and not just act beyond our actual experience. Our Dharma is not to throw ourselves off a cliff. Our Dharma is to think carefully, who am I really? What can I really do? And part of right living is to be able to be humble and honest about our actual ability. Even there, Swamiji had $50, he gave him half. He didn't empty his wallet into that man's hand because that wasn't being practical. Swami needed some of the money that he had, but he thought carefully, what can I give away? And that I'll help this person, and then when I need help, I will be helped again. So this was, I often call this doing your Dharma in a vacuum, which is just a phrase that means something to me. It's like I might be in a situation where it's not at all clear to me how this is going to unfold. It's not at all clear to me how one action is going to lead to another. But I know within the little circle that I can perceive that this is the right thing to do. And then I'll just do it and just see what happens. And many, many times through my life, if I just do the right thing according to what I know, according to what's appropriate for me, given my actual state of consciousness, not what I can read in a book and think is theoretically true, but what I can really trust with my own nature. So going all the way back to the polyurethane business with the heart, I realized that even though that would feel more safe, my entire commitment at that point in my life was to love and trust God sufficiently that I didn't always have to barricade myself. I had no idea until I came to live at Ananda Village, and at that time I was living at what is now the seclusion retreat, how incredibly barricaded I was, because I had always lived in uncongenial environments, not bad environments. I was very well brought up and very, very, very privileged without being wealthy, but I was very privileged and had been given every positive opportunity a person could have. But the whole atmosphere that I lived in was just so alien to my nature. It was just, I didn't understand this world at all. When I visualize myself, when I think about myself until I met Swami Kriyananda, until I was 19 and met self-realization, and then 22 when I met him, I think of myself as standing against the wall, looking into the room, trying to make sense of what I see around me. I even had a really weird experience when I was 13, which I think was actually a superconscious experience. It was probably my first. Because I was just out of step with the people around me, they could just do all this stuff so easily. I functioned. I wasn't unpopular or strange seeming, but I felt alien inside. Many of you can relate to that. I remember sitting at a little party that, like, 13-year-olds would have, and there's just nothing more agonizing than being 13 and going to a party. And I was sitting against the wall, and nobody was asking me to dance because nobody ever asked me to dance. And just sort of feeling like a stranger in a strange land. I had some inner voice, I guess, that said, fundamentally, I could make you popular. But in order to do so, you'd have to abandon, this compelling energy that was your real nature. And I said, no, I wouldn't accept that. And was that a real, quote, temptation? I really don't know. But very interesting, I can actually see myself sitting there. It was so real to me that it really happened. No. Truth, I have to follow the truth. I can't give it up just in order to have outward popularity. My happiness will not come to me from merely getting external things. So when I'm sitting there, when I get to Ananda finally, I realize, oh my gosh, I don't want to be barricaded against this energy. I want to be wide open to this energy. But a lifetime or lifetimes of protecting ourselves from uncongenial vibrations. And see, the issue is that overall, this world is uncongenial to the truth seeker because our culture is not at all refined. So we do have to be selective in what we let in, but we can't develop the habit of being closed. And then what happens is when we are selective and allow truth vibrations to come into us, and this is what I was speaking about yesterday, you allow the right vibrations, you feed the flame of true happiness. That's what I was wanting to say. What happens is that flame begins to burn so strongly inside of you that your inner reality determines your experience. And so that's how Swami Kriyananda could be wide open to anything that came to him, because he had developed so much inner magnetism that his magnetism determined his reality, not the vibrations around us. Yeah, it's a fine line because we have to be conscious of it. I remember after living at Ananda village, Ananda retreat then for, I don't know, maybe it was in my first year, it must have been. And I hadn't even hardly left the property except to just go into the little nearby town and come back for 6 or 8 or 10 months. I don't remember what the exact context was. But I had to drive to the Bay Area, and for some reason I was by myself. So it might have been a year or two later. I don't know what the deal was. But somehow or another, by that point, it must have been a little longer. It must have been a longer period of time. I had just learned to open myself to my environment because my environment was supportive. And I was driving down, and I had to stop at a gas station in a place I didn't know, and I ended up in a very rough part of town. And there were some rough characters around me. And I was just like a baby, just completely open. And I remember just sort of starting this conversation with some tough, rough guy there. And I was in my early 20s. I was just an attractive young woman, and I came up and start this super friendly conversation. And all of a sudden, I was aware that he was misreading my good energy. And all of a sudden, I just said, whoops, like that, sort of went back a little and became a little more impersonal about the whole thing and filled my car with gas and drove off. But this is the balance that we're working with. This is the true happiness. You have to feed the flame. And then when you feed the flame, that's what gives you the power to move through this world as Swamiji is asking us. God bless you, my friends.